If you're Southern, your grandma didn't need tarot cards to know something was coming. She didn't check the news. She didn't ask for a reading. She dropped a fork, looked over her shoulder, and said, "Company's coming." And 9 times out of 10, they were. In kitchens all across the South, and plenty outside it too, magic didn't wear a robe or burn incense. It wore house shoes. Stirred with the same wooden spoon it had for 30 years, and it whispered warnings while the greens were cooking down. You spill salt? That's trouble. Burn the biscuits? That's a visitor. 2 people stir the same pot? You'll be at each other's throats before dark. And if the cornbread splits while it's baking, somebody's lying, or pregnant, or both. Kitchen omens don't ask for attention. They show up, quiet, familiar, baked right into the routines we call normal. They don't carry candlelight or perform chants. They live in the way the dough rises, the way the stove hisses, and the way your guts twist when the pot won't boil right. These aren't superstitions. They're survival habits, handed down in teaspoons and passed quietly from mothers who had mouths to feed and knew how to tell when something was coming before it hit the porch. This isn't magic you light with a match. It's the kind you stir. I'm Papa G, and this is the Feral Folklorist. Today we're going back into the kitchen, where you don't need spell books to see the signs, and the back burner has more to say than half the internet. So pull up a chair, mind your spoon, and if you drop a fork while we're talking, well, go ahead and set one more place at the table. The kitchen hasn't always been treated like the cozy center of the home. It used to be where the fire lived, where spirits came in through the chimney, where you kept iron by the door, not because of burglars, but because of what came in on the wind. It was the place where the boundary between the practical and the magical got really thin, because you didn't have time for ritual robes and candles when you had mouths to feed. You had flour, salt, smoke, and instinct, and that was enough. Long before modern kitchens were about islands and granite countertops, the hearth was sacred. It's where you cooked, but it was also where you prayed, where you protected, and where you grieved. In ancient Rome, the goddess Vesta was honored through fire. Offerings went straight into the flame. Flour, salt, oil, all meant to keep the home safe and steady. The Vestal virgins kept that flame burning for the entire empire, and if it went out, it was considered a bad omen for everyone. In Slavic homes, the domovoi, the house spirit, was said to live behind the stove. Feed him properly, keep his corner clean, and your household would stay in balance. Now, if you upset him, things would break, and food would spoil, or animals would die. In Jewish tradition, the Shabbat candles lit in the kitchen carried a whole different kind of protection. It was both ritual and shield. It marked time, but it also marked space. Now, in West African traditions, many of which carried over into the American South, cooking itself was spiritual, not metaphorical. It was literal. Women brought with them a whole system of using spices for more than flavor. There was pepper to stir heat and salt to block harm. And simmering pots were meant to purify the air. These were not luxuries. They were tools. They were defensive work. It was ritual, magic, but very quiet. And in rural Europe, kitchens were where you found the healers. the midwives, the women who boiled herbs not just for health, but for diagnosis in spiritual conditions. If your bread failed to rise or your milk curdled for no reason, they knew what it meant. They watched, they took notes, and knew what to do if your biscuits burned on a clear day. So kitchen omens aren't complicated. They're immediate. They come with a heat and a scent and a gut feeling. So here's a handful you'll still hear in homes across the South and Appalachia. Drop a fork, a woman's coming. If you drop a knife, a man is on his way. If you drop a spoon, company's coming, but you won't know who until they knock. If the bread gets burned, someone's hiding a secret. And if you spilled salt, trouble's coming unless you toss a pinch over your left shoulder to blind whatever's behind you. And yes, both my husband and myself still do this to this day. Now, if your biscuits won't rise, someone in the house is pregnant or they're lying. If there's a kettle that hisses really hard or whistles out of nowhere, someone's mad and it's not just about the weather. If two people stir the same pot, they'll fight. You can pretty much count on it. And if a broom that falls, company's coming. If you sweep after dark, you risk sweeping out all of your good luck. And if you can't find the salt when you know it was there a second ago, somebody's talking about you. These weren't just throwaway sayings. They were warning systems built into daily life, and they were different according to where you lived or who had taught you, because some would just say, if a fork fell, company's coming. Others, it would be a woman, and they would interchange these different utensils for different things. But like I said, it depended on who taught you, because the kitchen was the one room in the house where everything came together. It was food and family. It could be emotion and all this energy and sometimes fatigue. It's where people rocked their babies while the beans were being stirred, or where sometimes grief was stirred into the cornbread and then people could taste it. It's where a woman could watch someone walk through the door, glance at the stove, and know whether they meant peace or harm. So in traditional witchcraft, especially European and Afro-Caribbean variants, utensils weren't symbolic, they were active. A ladle wasn't just a spoon, it stirred emotion into food. And a rolling pin could press intention into dough, whether it be healing, or maybe calming, or binding, or blessing. Breads could also carry tokens inside. I mean, there could be coins for money, buttons for change, and beans for uncertainty. And salt near the oven or tucked behind the door wasn't for seasoning. It was to keep something out. And eggs, don't get folks started on eggs, because there are so many different traditions, sayings around eggs. For example, a double yolk means twins or a doubling of luck. If you have a yolk that won't break, you've got someone clinging to you. It could be spiritually or emotionally. And an egg that rolls off the counter and doesn't break, that means someone just dodged a hex. Of course, we've all heard of how many people do egg cleansings by rolling an egg around someone to clear their energy, usually from a black hen. And there is the act of doing divination by breaking an egg into a glass of water to read, usually the white parts of the egg. None of this came from books. It came from watching your elders. Generation after generation, somebody stirred the stew and remembered what happened the last time the spoon spun counterclockwise instead of clockwise. In the kitchen, you didn't need a priest when your aunt was already there and knew how to read the bubbles in the pot. You didn't need a protective circle when the stove had iron in it and the floor was swept with intention. And you didn't need spells that rhymed when your mama's hand on a rolling pin already meant protection and grief and prayer all at once. This is magic grounded in domestic labor. It's grounded in hunger, in watching and observing, in knowing that when the biscuits burn, something's off, and in trusting that knowing. You don't need a shelf full of candles and crystals to start reading signs. You've already got what you need in your spice cabinet, in your cutlery drawer, and the way your kitchen feels when you walk in after a long day. Because in folk magic, the kitchen isn't a backdrop. It's the altar. It's the divination board. It's where energy moves through food and scent and heat and leaves warnings behind. So let's break some of that down. Let's talk about dropped utensils. The one everyone knows. We talked about dropping a fork of visitors coming. More specifically, we said if it's a fork, it's a woman, and a knife, a man. A spoon means it could go either way. But there's more to it than that. How it lands matters. If it hits handle first, it's someone familiar. If the sharp end hits first, you've got unexpected news walking towards you. And if it lands pointing at the door, that's the direction they're coming from. Now, if it spins in place, their intentions aren't settled yet, so you need to keep a watchful eye. This is old sympathetic magic. The tool represents the guests, and when it jumps out of your hand without warning, something has been set in motion. You're not being clumsy, you're being notified. There's more about burning food and overboiling pots, because burning food isn't just about distraction. In spiritual terms, it usually means something is energetically off in the house. So if the biscuits won't rise, or the cornbread splits too wide down the middle, or if the beans refuse to cook all the way through, something is out of alignment. In Appalachian lore, a sudden burn, especially in something you've made dozens of times before, means either a secret is being kept or someone's on the way. And if a pot boils over after you've already turned it down, it can be a sign of a spiritual spillover. Someone's anger or their fear or this tension that's taking up more space than it should. That's not really superstition. That's the kitchen reacting to what it's holding. So let's talk about stirring the pot, both literally and energetically. There's a reason your grandma didn't let just anyone help stir the stew. Because two people stirring the same pot at the same time, that's cross energy. In magical logic, it's a recipe for arguments because two sets of hands have two different sets of intentions. It's also why direction matters. Stirring clockwise draws energy in. It brings blessings and attraction and healing. But stirring counterclockwise sends energy out. It's for banishing and breaking and clearing things. So if you're making soup for someone who's sick, you stir it clockwise and say their name under your breath with each turn. Now, if you're trying to shake off tension that's in the house, you would stir your tea counterclockwise, and you toss the last sip into the sink while giving out this big sigh. These are spells in plain sight. It's something everybody's mama knew, but they didn't really teach it to their children. They didn't say, here, pay attention to this. Their children were usually learned by watching them. So then we move on to like salts and spices. Because folk magic doesn't separate food from power. Every herb, every pinch of spice has a meaning. So salt, for example, it's protective, it's purifying, and it's sealing. If you spill it, like we said, toss a pinch over your left shoulder. It's not just a superstitious habit. It is considered a spiritual course correction. Take a bay leaf and write a name or a question on it. Toss it into the soup and see which way it floats. If it sticks to the edge, that name, that person you run in there is sort of a hanger on. They're staying around. They're not wanting to go somewhere. Or maybe that's what you want. Maybe you want to see if husband intends to stay, and that would answer your question. Black pepper, it cuts through lies and it clears stale energy. Add a little to food when maybe gossip has been too heavy. Rosemary, it's about remembrance. It's about clarity and safety, and you boil it in water for a cleansing simmer pot. And then garlic you've got as classic protection. You hang it in braids near your stove or tuck a clove behind the flour jar to help keep the energy clean. Of course, we all know to keep vampires away, but that wasn't really in Appalachian folk tradition. So if someone brings you food and your stomach tightens when you smell it, don't eat it. Trust the kitchen's warning system. It knows before you do. So what happens if a knife falls? Knives have their own energy in folk practice. If one falls from the counter, that's usually a male visitor or someone cutting into your space emotionally. But the direction it falls matters too, because if it's pointing at the door, like we said, that's where they're coming from. If it's sticking into the floor, you've got unfinished work that needs grounding. And if it falls and bounces twice, it's about hesitation. The visitor is unsure and their energy is sort of mixed. So never ignore a knife that moves on its own. Clean it, speak your name aloud, and place it back deliberately. That sort of resets its charge. Ask any Southerner who grew up around the kitchen, and they'll tell you, sometimes the warning doesn't come from a ghost or a tarot card. It comes from the stove. It's not loud. It's not often dramatic. Sometimes it's a little too quiet, and you have to really pay attention. Sometimes it's very still and waiting for you to notice. But when it happens, the folks who know. They don't say anything about it right away. They listen, they watch, and later they say, yeah, I felt it too. There is a story out of Georgia, and you probably heard one like it, where a woman says her kettle started screaming one afternoon. Not just whistling, but screaming. She'd boiled water in it 100 times, and it never made that sound before. It didn't spill, it didn't steam over, it just wailed. She turned off the burner and checked everything. Nothing was wrong, but something felt wrong. Her heart was racing and her hands were shaking, and she said the hair on her arms stood up like it was January in that hot kitchen. And 10 minutes later, the phone rang. Her daughter had gone into labor 6 weeks early. The baby came fast, but it was healthy, and the kettle never made that noise again. Sometimes the kitchen is warning you, not because something bad is coming, but because something big is coming. Now, we've mentioned it a couple of times. Let's get into those burned biscuits, because there's a story out of North Carolina where a woman tells about burning her biscuits one morning. She wasn't distracted. She hadn't changed the recipe. She had just popped them in, set the timer, and walked away. When she pulled them back out, they were black on the bottom, and she swore she smelled ash, even though the pan was clean. That afternoon, an old friend showed up at the door. Hadn't seen him in years. He was passing through looking for somewhere to land for a few days. So she poured him a cup of coffee and said, I burned the biscuits this morning. Figured somebody was coming. Sometimes the warning isn't what happens. It's what doesn't stop happening. In one house, after the matriarch died, the kitchen wouldn't cool off. Not in summer, not in winter. Even with the windows open, it felt like someone had left the oven on. The new homeowner had acquired the house with a lot of the furnishings and the appliances, so the stove was still there. They checked and it wasn't about insulation. Everything checked out. But then they found her cast iron skillet tucked behind the stove. It was still a little oily, still warm somehow, And what they did was they left a plate of food and a candle beside it. And the next morning, the kitchen was cool and it felt settled and still. Because sometimes a kitchen isn't finished until it's honored. So in another house, in another kitchen, every time the homeowner tried to cook, she couldn't find the salt. She checked the pantry and the shelf and the cabinet where it always lived, and it was just gone. So the next day, there it was, sitting on the washing machine. The day after that, inside the freezer. The third time, she found it on the back porch. Her aunt told her, "Somebody's talking about you. Someone with heat behind their tongue." So she tossed the salt in the yard, swept the floor from back to front, and burned a match at every window. And then it didn't happen again. And the next time her phone rang, it was someone she'd been thinking about, but not kindly. And now we have the spell segment of our episode. And let me tell you, the kitchen doesn't need a priest or a prayer always. It just needs someone who pays attention. Someone who notices when the salt's disappearing or the spoon's jumping out of a pot for no reason, and knows those aren't accidents, they're alerts. And once you learn to recognize them, you won't need a deck of cards to know what's shifting in your house. So we're going to look at a few kitchen-rooted workings that are very easy, quiet, and real. And the first one is a kitchen blessing packet. And the purpose is to bring peace and protection into your cooking space. And what you'll need is a bay leaf, a pinch of salt, a garlic clove. It can be a dried peel if that's all you have, a thread or string, and a white cloth or muslin bag. What you do is you place the bay leaf, the salt, and the garlic in the bag, in the cloth bag, and you tie it closed with the thread, knot it 3 times, and you hang it near the stove. And as you do, you say, "By fire and steam, by salt and spice, let peace live here, let harm think twice." And you replace it once a year or when you feel the energy shift. So that's a very simplistic form of magic you can do with a few basic kitchen ingredients and a cloth bag. The other is a fork on the floor divination. And it's to interpret who's coming and why they're coming. And the thing you'll need here is a clean fork. If one dropped recently, use that one. A small white plate, a tea candle, and a slip of paper. And you're going to light the candle and place it on the plate. You set the fork beside it, handle pointing towards the door. And on the paper you write, "Who is coming?" or "What do I need to know?" And you tuck the paper under the plate. And let the candle burn all the way down. And you watch the flame. If the flame bends towards the fork, it's someone familiar, someone you know. If it leans away from the fork, a stranger's coming. Now, if it flickers really hard and has this unsettled energy, it tells you to keep alert. And then you burn or bury the paper to close out the reading. So that's a very simple way to just, if you drop a fork, you do this small ritual to figure out what's going on before it actually happens. And then we have another one. It's a kitchen cleansing simmer pot. So it's to cleanse out like spiritual funk and to reset the space in the kitchen. And here what you need is simply water, a lemon peel, some dried rosemary. It can be fresh too. A bay leaf, once again, and a little dash of vinegar. So you're going to add all this to the pot and let it simmer with the lid off. And as the scent fills the kitchen, speak aloud. Whatever's lingering here, I want you to leave. Whatever's heavy, I want you to lift and dissipate This is my space and it's going to stay clear. Then you crack a window, which would release whatever the steam grabbed a hold of, and it lets it out the window and it lets the air change. And then you pour the leftover water at your front step. Your kitchen already knows what it's doing. All you have to do is listen. So don't wait for the fire to go out or the split to form in your cornbread. You watch and see how the steam curls in the pot, and you notice when the salt disappears. And remember, if a fork hits the floor, that's a message. I'm Papa G, and you've been listening to the Feral Folklorist. Next time, we're heading to one of the most famously haunted houses in the South, the Myrtles Plantation. And we're going to talk about mirrors that trap spirits, the legend of Chloe, and what happens when mourning and magic live in the same room. Until then, if you drop a fork, save yourself some time and go ahead and set another place at the table. If you'd like to hear the after the show episode where I go deeper into the folklore, spill a little extra dirt, and sometimes rant just a bit, consider becoming a patron over on my Patreon at patreon.com/PapaG. You can find the official site for the podcast at feralfolklorist.com. And if you need spell supplies for any of the workings we talk about on the show, our metaphysical shop, Aromagees Botanica, has been weaving magic for over 25 years. That's over at aromagees.com. And finally, don't forget about our digital magazine, Folklorium, for articles, herbal profiles, spells, and a little bit of folkloric fiction at folklorium.com.